Okay, so this is Teaching Without a Net, what to do when class goes off script. For those of you that don't know me, although I think everyone here does, I'm Erica Jansen. I work for the Teaching and Learning Center, but today I'm really coming at this presentation as a first year writing instructor and as an adjunct. This was hugely shaped by my experiences in the classroom this year, and even most particularly last semester. We'll get into that in a bit, but this will be a pretty short presentation and even shorter now that the tech has sort of run wild. But I don't want this to feel passive. So what I'm hoping to do is to make the chat a really sort of lively, discursive, and animated space where you all feel free sort of sharing your own experiences, possible solutions or strategies you've built, questions you still have, or just thoughts. The chat will be moderated by our fabulous TLC team. And Amber sort of also left me with the real hope that today begins a conversation, and certainly isn't the end of one. That next year, as we look towards our planning for 2026, 2027, we're looking into humanizing the student experience. And sort of this conversation about civil discourse in the classroom will be a really integral part of that. So think of this as an opening. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and there's really nothing that makes me happier than a really lively chat. So first and foremost, like this was my main question in August when I got this ask is like, what do we mean by off script, right? It can mean so many different things. The classroom goes off the rails in 1,000 ways that we'll talk about. But what I landed on for today, what I felt like was most important to talk about were moments in your classroom in which a comment, a response, or a discussion heads in a direction that you just did not anticipate. And it requires from you as the instructor, as the professor, as the facilitator, a more thoughtful response. This has come up in my own teaching this year and certainly in the years before. But I wanted to take a pause right now and sort of ask of this group, or for anyone who's listening later, to think, have you had a moment in your teaching where a student said something or wrote something just really unexpected and you were not sure how to respond? And if you want, feel free to put that in the chat to sort of start a conversation so we could see sort of like what we're working with. But even if you don't, I'd invite you to sort of hold that as we go through this presentation and think about how you responded, how you might respond, like what strategies you employed or could employ to really make that an effective teaching moment. But before we get into effective responses to student comments or student writing that take us sort of off guard, I think it's really important to return and remind ourselves of the grounding principles in our classroom, the things we know to be true for an effective sort of learning community. And this turned into this presentation more than anything, an appeal for civil discourse. There's a really interesting course being taught right now at Kalamazoo. I think this article came out as recently as this weekend. It's an entire undergraduate course that just focuses on civil discourse and how we talk to each other and how to be productive and intellectually curious and to hold our sources up to rigorous standards. And the professor of that course, Justin Berry, says in this article, and I think Tracy will post it in the chat, some scholars talk about the need for civil disagreement, but this course really talks about civil agreement. This generation hasn't really been taught to disagree in a way that demonstrates understanding and respect for the person they're engaging with. So certainly, I don't think it's controversial to say that the worlds and spaces in which our students find themselves in are often by design not meant to connect threads of thought or commonalities between people of different perspectives. And so to enter into a classroom assuming that students have that knowledge, I think is a real lost opportunity for teaching. And so I wanted to take a moment, and I took this moment just even to remind myself last semester of what I already knew to be true, what I assumed sort of we all shared as values in higher education, but which I think bears repeating explicitly and intentionally for our students. To sort of, in that world we create in 8 weeks when we teach a course, to sort of say out loud, this is the environment I'm creating. These are the standards I'm upholding. And this is what has to exist for us to push forward sort of new knowledge, to co-create knowledge, and to sort of like be in this space together. So I'm going to say them out loud because I think they're so important. We demand curiosity and rigor in our sources and data. We require respect and consideration in classroom discourse, and we discuss ideas with a shared goal of learning from each other. And in some ways, I think this is countercultural in this moment, and therefore needs to be said sort of in an academic space before, especially a first year writing course where many students are coming into this after a hugely long break from education, right out of high school. Just as sort of we welcome them into higher education, the discourse of higher education, and what a community in higher education looks like. So I'm going to tell you now the example and story I was going to lead with when I got this back in September. And this is sort of a story about, I suppose, my own shared misstep, although I'm pulling in my entire graduate cohort with this. So when I was in graduate school, I took a class on detective fiction. And every week we had to read a work of detective fiction. And then we sat down in a 3-hour seminar and we discussed it, right? Like we did Sherlock Holmes, we did Silence of the Lambs. And one week we did Mary Higgins Clark, right? So we all come in, there's like 8 of us. Our instructor is there, but the class like hasn't started. And we just start like trashing Mary Higgins Clark. We are roasting her. Like we're poking holes in the plot. We're laughing at the sensationalism. We're like pulling out all the tired tropes. Like, can you believe? And our instructor, one of my favorite instructors in grad school, Professor Tom Leach, he sat there and let it go on like 15 minutes, right? And then after 15 minutes, we all got really quiet and sort of like looked at him like, are you gonna start class? And he looked around at each one of us, like there were 8, it was a small circle, and delivered like one of the coldest openings that I still obviously think about to this day. He looked around and said, does any one of you have anything more interesting to say? And like the silence. We were so glib. And suddenly now we were like scrambling to say something more intelligent, like more intellectually curious, like just wanted to impress this instructor who had just humbled us with a single question. And what he really did there, which I have found has been useful now in all my courses, like this question has like haunted me now for the rest of my career, my graduate education, but now when I teach. It set up again the framework of the discourse objectives of what we were trying to do in that course, what the goals of the course were, and what we were asking of ourselves as students, right? So I pulled this framework from Johns Hopkins, but I would encourage anyone teaching to look at the frameworks within their field, their teaching philosophies, something that matches your class. But I think it's helpful to have this sort of explanation at the start of every discussion so that you can too have a cold opening like my graduate professor, to return your students back to the objectives of the discourse or the conversation when, the topic starts to go astray. And I also just want to point out, I say discourse here because I don't just mean Canvas discussions. I mean every nook and cranny of conversation within a college course. The Canvas chat, emails to you, assignments, like face-to-face discussions, asynchronous discussions. I think we can uphold these standards sort of across the board as an expectation for how we speak in higher ed. So this list looks like the discussion should be evaluative, creative, and innovative. They should model civil and constructive disagreement as a means of intellectual progress. Discussion should connect to the learning material and provide a means to apply the learning, and discussion should support the learning objectives. And when we make these objectives really clear and transparent, it gives us sort of a ground to redirect any conversation that begins to fall short. And I use this example where I laugh at myself and sort of my smugness and all of this little circle of graduate students. But I think it's universally applicable to remind ourselves of the goals of sort of a college course. So this was the example I was going to use. But then last semester, I had another example of a student response to a prompt that was just wildly unexpected. And it was really sort of like a shake me by the shoulders moment of realizing that to do this presentation in a way that really met the moment we are teaching in, I would have to sort of take a different approach. This is still true, but I want to walk you through a different example that shapes sort of the strategies of the second half of this presentation. I share with you first the prompt because I really want to point out how unexpected this was, how this response was really surprising. And honestly, I don't think I could have foresaw um, this sort of comment from a student given the prompt. So this is a first year writing class last semester. The prompt was to do a free write where you sort of write without stopping as you're thinking through a topic or a prompt. And the prompt was to identify an ethos related item and then to analyze how your target audience might react to this example of ethos you found in the text. And just for background, the text really just argued that the decision for what is ethical or unethical use of AI in the classroom should not fall on the shoulders of students, but should be shared by the institution and the instructor. Um, that was the article. I'm going to share the student response. When I do the recording, I'm not going to include the student response just to protect that student's privacy, but I think it's really important for you guys to sort of see the moment I'm referring to when I sort of designed this presentation and thought, how do I meet this moment in a way that is really effective and just authentic for my students? I'm not going to read it out loud. You guys can read it. But I would also I think it's worth pointing out that the class this student is talking about and the frustration, as far as I can tell, this is not my class. We never discussed these topics. This didn't come up in our reading in any of the course content. Like this was separate from anything we had discussed or would discuss in our course. But this was the student's response to analyzing ethos in a text about AI in the classroom. And sort of my knee-jerk reaction was not how do I respond to this student because it was an assignment and I knew this could be sort of an individual conversation. My aha moment was if this was so unexpected in response to an assignment, what will I do if this shows up on our discussion board? And I didn't really have a plan for that because I just had this assumption that that sort of language or that sort of like discourse would not appear in our classroom because there was no invitation for it, right? It was felt to me completely out of the blue. And my immediate response was, how do I protect other students from having to engage with this and what's meant to be a learning community? So today, in the last portion of this presentation, I'm going to outline the 3 research-backed strategies that I came up with for what I would do if a student comment really goes off the rails in a way that impacts other students and our ability to have sort of a respectful, civil, and productive conversation. So we'll talk about how to strategize responses to surprising student work and comments. Like in this case, it was an assignment. I had to respond in SpeedGrader. To name ways to create a pause in live discussions, like what do we do when this happens face to face? And then to create a framework for facilitating asynchronous discussions, right? Like my biggest concern is what happens if I get sort of a really incivil response on a Canvas discussion board. Like I need a plan. But first, I think what might be the most straightforward of strategies is what to do if it's written feedback individually with that student, as it was in this case. In my own experience, I find it always helpful to take a pause, right? So I shut my computer, walked away, sort of processed it, and thought about how do I make this the best teaching moment that I am capable of? And I also would hugely recommend that you have a colleague you trust to hold you to the highest standards of teaching. So shout out to Tracy because she was the person I reached out to say, this feels tense, like it could go many different ways. And my goal is for this student to leave, a better critical thinker. It certainly doesn't help this student for me not to address this moment, right? not in his next course, not in his job, like to not say, hey, the discourse doesn't match the context, and that really matters. Um, but how do I do so in a way that's, productive and protects the student, protects me, protects the institution, like all of the things. So I think in general, the rubric and the goals of the assignment almost always save you. You can go back to the language of the course to show how the response is off topic, how it misses the goals of the assignment. And in the spirit of every moment being a learning moment, you can invite the student to rewrite it to meet the goals of the assignment, right? To revise it in a way that better reflects what we hold to be true in academic classrooms. Um, and so for me, this particular situation was not as fraught as what I would do in a live discussion. And I would love to see in the chat if you've had sort of moments of surprise or moments of like, I did not expect this on an assignment, like what sort of feedback you felt to be really helpful and productive for that student to, continue to do better in the next thing they tackle in life, whether it's week 6, 7, 8, or the next course or eventually when they're in their field on the job, right? Our job is really to bring them into the discourse. But my bigger like moment of like, Erica, you need to create a plan here is what I would do in a live discussion. And I sort of pulled from what I call a back pocket pause. So if you're in a discussion with a class and it's happening live, right? You're like face to face, or maybe you're teaching via Zoom. It is so imperative in moments of surprise or disruption that you have a back pocket plan, something that's already decided, it's a formula or a template, because research shows that in moments of high tension or when you're caught off guard, it's really hard to be creative. It's really hard to think on your feet to create that space. So having it in your back pocket, whether it's a 5-minute free write based on a prompt, a quote that you decide the class is going to individually work on a close reading, a search for academic sources to bring to the conversation if you're teaching via Zoom, or even just like a pause and a return to those discourse objectives. Thinking back to my graduate professor, to remind ourselves of the goals of the conversation, just a pause and a step away. I have used this pause not just for like disruptions in the classroom, but also I used it when a student didn't feel well and needed help getting to the med center. I used it when I was teaching at Laughlin Air Force Base and the tornado sirens went off and I was like supposed to go under my desk to hide. Right? So there's like all kinds of ways where like a pause just helps you out in a moment where you're not creative to think of a different teaching approach. And then during that pause, you can decide to continue the discussion, to shift topics, or to reprise it in a new context. Like maybe it's not a discussion, but individual assignments that students need to think through. Every moment can be a learning moment. I return to this over and over, where the goal is for everyone in that classroom to see, A, I protect the space of civil discourse, but B, we all walk away better able to converse with each other. And certainly there have to be some boundaries in our conversation of what is allowed to count and what does not. And then the third sort of situation that I was imagining that was realistic for my own classroom is what to do in an online discussion when a comment appears that really takes you by surprise and perhaps sort of harms that learning community you're trying to create. And in an online discussion, I would argue there's a real need for immediacy and not pause, because the longer a comment stands, the more likely it is that the folks in that classroom might see you as either sort of approving it or letting it go, of not being present within the classroom, like maybe you didn't notice it, or just ignoring it, choosing not to handle it. And I thought to myself, like, if this appears, I really don't have a framework set up that allows me to respond in a way that's clear to my students and clear to me. So I developed this in one of my conversations with Tracy, and I pull this sort of from social media. Which is part of the problem, right? I'm using the solution from something that's contributing to our problems. But the idea of having community guidelines and a violation for those guidelines. So the language looks familiar, but I think the intent and purpose in an academic setting is really different. And it gives me a path forward and gives other students a path forward too. So in those guidelines, I will say that I will remove comments from our discussion board that violate our community guidelines and ask you to try again in a way that follows them. And then says to the students, if you feel a comment or a post violates our community guidelines, please message me so that I can ensure our discourse is civil and productive. And then what that does, it also allows students sort of a back channel to me to say like, hey, this makes me feel uncomfortable, or this makes me feel like I can no longer participate in the discussion, like I'm not welcome, like we're not talking about ideas anymore. Um, and can also help them bring it to my attention faster because I know, especially with the new format of discussion boards, it can often be like a comment to a comment to a comment, like 2 or 3 click throughs to see every comment. So this sort of gives an immediacy and a course of action the second that something sort of violates what we agree are just community standards for an academic conversation. And then last, I would say before I share with you potential community guidelines is just document everything. So if you delete a comment, save it so that if the student pushes back or you're writing to the student, you can point out, hey, here's where a violation occurred. Like, here's where this can't contribute productively to a class discussion. And I invite you to revise it by doing X, Y, Z. Like, the goal is always to elevate the thinking and elevate the writing. It's not to shut out voices. Is to teach them to get to interesting, like get to a place where you're teaching me something, where we co-create knowledge, where we respect and seek to understand each other. So document everything. But this is a pathway I thought of to move forward. And again, I would love to see or hear in the chat other solutions or approaches you've had to ensuring online discussion spaces feel really civil. And then last, I just wanted to give you sort of examples of what community guidelines could look like. This comes from the University of Michigan Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. And if you click through, Tracy, I'll put the link in the chat. Again, thank you, Tracy. There's a plethora of sort of community guideline examples. And just as your framework for discussions might be specific to your field and your class, the community guidelines might as well. But I found a few of these would have protected the space that I was trying to create if I posted them in advance. So I'll just read a few. Listen actively with an ear to understanding others' views, criticize ideas, not individuals. Commit to learning, not debating. Comment in order to share information, not persuade. Avoid blame, speculation, and inflammatory language. And avoid assumptions about any member of the class or generalization about social groups. Do not ask individuals to speak for their perceived social group. I think before last semester, maybe before this year, these are not things that I had thought to say out loud. But I realized sort of what a lost opportunity it was to not make explicit the sort of values and the values we hold dear as academics, as teachers, and that we hope to bring to our students to create sort of a learning community that they leave feeling more curious, supported, welcome, but also capable of having a conversation that creates knowledge, and doesn't necessarily try to define or limit it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was really meaningful and deep. You kind of rocked my soul a little bit. We will be, putting this in video format and sharing it out with everybody. So even if
I
you
do want
couldn't
to,
come, yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
I just wanted to add, Erica, I think one of the things that's super powerful about what you've done is you've made this topic accessible to all of
Mm,
us, right? By sharing something that specifically happened. And it is hard when it happens right in the process of teaching and you're thinking, how do I get through this? But I loved the idea of the simplicity of creating those kind of guidelines for interaction because it allows you to have that immediate reaction and to be able to pull it, not necessarily saying I'm deleting your ideas, but that gives you your chance to pause. Like when you pull it out and you're like, okay, wait, now let's figure out, what this is and what it is. It's just such a great conversation. And that's where it becomes coaching, not catching, because
mm,
you've been able to really identify and bring to light, like notice and name what's actually going on, even if that wasn't their interpretation. So I like thank you for adding in what to do in these situations because often the
mm.
times we don't get that